where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to the Countess's Chronicles channel.
Did you know that the greatest love stories in nobility were never about perfect princes and princesses? They were about secrets so deep they could destroy entire empires. And today, you're going to discover a truth that high society tried to erase from history. A duke who pretended to be poor to find true love. That's right. One of the richest men in England lied about who he was, lived like a beggar, and quietly married a seamstress who had absolutely nothing. Sounds crazy? Well, that's exactly what makes this story real. While everyone sells you the fairy tale where the prince saves the poor girl, nobody tells you what really happens when someone powerful gives up everything for a genuine connection. Get ready, because this story is going to turn upside down everything you thought you knew about love, power, and what really matters when you're about to lose it all. In the next few minutes, you'll understand why sometimes the greatest wealth is being loved for who you really are, not for what you have. And in the end, you'll ask yourself, would you have the courage to choose true love if it meant losing the approval of everyone around you? Stay with me until the end, because this revelation will change the way you see relationships forever. You know that feeling when life's been nothing but gray walls and silent rooms, and suddenly someone walks in carrying color you didn't even know existed? That's what happened to Eleanor. She'd spent 29 years being invisible, the kind of invisible where people look right through you like you're made of glass. Her little sewing shop was her whole world, tucked away in a forgotten corner where dreams go to collect dust. Every day was the same. Mend, stitch, collect coins, sleep, repeat. But here's the secret nobody tells you about being invisible. You start believing that's all you deserve. You start thinking that maybe you're not meant to be seen, that perhaps your story doesn't get the happy chapters. Eleanor had made peace with that, or so she thought, until a stranger with tired eyes and a torn coat showed up and shattered every belief she'd built around her heart. Thomas walked into her shop on a Tuesday. Isn't it funny how life-changing moments always happen on the most ordinary days? He didn't say much, just handed over this old coat with a rip along the shoulder. Eleanor noticed his hands first. Rough, weathered, but gentle when he placed the coat on her counter. She stitched it carefully, like she did with everything, pouring into that repair the kind of attention most people reserve for precious things. When she handed it back, he counted out coins, exact change, nothing extra, but honest. That's when their eyes met, and something shifted in the universe. There was this enigma in his gaze, something she couldn't quite name but felt deep in her bones. It wasn't pity, wasn't desire, it was recognition. Like he saw past the invisible cloak she'd wrapped herself in for years. He came back the following week. Then again. Each time with something that needed fixing. A shirt with a missing button, trousers with a frayed hem, a vest that had seen better days. They started talking, real talking, not the empty pleasantries people exchange to fill silence. Thomas asked about her day, like the answer actually mattered. He'd lean against the counter and listen, truly listen, while she rambled about thread quality or the difficulty of matching certain fabrics. There's this beautiful thing that happens when someone treats your ordinary as extraordinary. Eleanor found herself laughing at his dry humor, looking forward to Tuesdays and Thursdays when he'd appear. The vestiges of loneliness that had built up over decades started crumbling piece by piece. She didn't know it yet, but she was falling, and there'd be no going back. 3 weeks into their little routine, right in the middle of a conversation about how the baker down the street burned everything he touched, Thomas went quiet. Eleanor looked up from her sewing, worried she'd said something wrong. That's what invisible people do. We always assume we're the problem. But Thomas was just watching her with this expression she'd never seen on anyone's face before. Then, he cleared his throat and asked the question that would change everything. "Eleanor, would you marry me?" Just like that. No build-up, no grand gesture, just 6 words that hung in the air like a secret waiting to be discovered. She froze, needle suspended mid-stitch, wondering if she'd heard him right, or if loneliness had finally driven her mad. The silence stretched so long that Thomas started apologizing, words tumbling out in this rush of vulnerability that broke her heart wide open. He explained he was sick. Doctors gave him months, maybe a year if he was lucky. He didn't want to die alone in some cold room with nothing but regret for company. "You're the first person in years who makes me remember that life can be kind," he said, voice cracking on the word kind. Eleanor could have said no. Should have. Probably. Every logical bone in her body screamed that this was madness, that you don't marry strangers, that pity isn't a foundation for anything real. But here's what nobody tells you about being chosen for the first time in your life. Logic becomes irrelevant. This man, this mysterious stranger with secrets hiding in his eyes, had picked her. Out of everyone in the world, he'd walked into her shop and decided she was worth staying alive for. She thought about all those romance novels she'd read by candlelight, the ones where love swoops in and rescues people from ordinary lives. She'd always thought those stories were forbidden to people like her, the plain ones, the forgotten ones, the ones who exist in the margins. But here it was, her own impossible story, wrapped in the most unconventional package imaginable. "Yes," she heard herself say, and the word felt like jumping off a cliff with no idea if there'd be water below. Thomas's face transformed. Relief, joy, something that looked dangerously close to love flooding his features. They didn't kiss, didn't even touch. Just stood there on opposite sides of the counter, 2 broken people who'd somehow found each other in the wreckage. Eleanor felt tears on her cheeks and didn't bother wiping them away. That night, alone in her tiny room above the shop, Eleanor couldn't sleep. Her mind kept circling back to the surreal conversation, to the way Thomas had looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking for years. Was this love? She didn't know. All she knew was that for the first time since she could remember, she felt something other than numb. There was this conflict brewing inside her, fear wrestling with hope, doubt dancing with possibility. What if he changed his mind? What if this was some cruel joke the universe was playing? But louder than the fear was this whisper, this tiny voice saying, "What if it's real?" She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heart beat faster than it had in years. Tomorrow, she'd be someone's wife. Someone had chosen her. That had to mean something, right? The next morning, Eleanor woke up to find Thomas waiting outside her shop with wildflowers he'd picked himself, probably from the field near the church where nobody goes. They got married that afternoon, quick and quiet, with the priest looking mildly confused but willing. Eleanor wore her best dress, which wasn't saying much, and Thomas wore that coat she'd mended, now cleaned and pressed. When the priest asked if she took this man, Eleanor looked into Thomas's eyes and saw her future, however long or short it might be. "I do," she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. As they walked out of that church as husband and wife, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just signed up for something much bigger than a simple arrangement between 2 lonely souls. There was something Thomas wasn't telling her, some hidden truth lurking beneath the surface. But right then, with her hand in his, she decided that some mysteries are worth living with. The first few months of marriage unfolded like a secret garden Eleanor never knew existed. She'd wake up before dawn, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. There's something sacred about making tea for someone who actually appreciates it, you know? She'd watch Thomas sleep sometimes, noticing how peaceful he looked, how different from that first day when exhaustion seemed carved into every line of his face. Their cottage was small, barely enough room to swing a cat, but it felt like a palace to someone who'd spent her whole life in a room above a sewing shop. Eleanor discovered she was happy. Genuinely, surprisingly, almost suspiciously happy. It was the kind of happiness that makes you nervous because you're not used to holding something so fragile. She'd catch herself smiling while darning socks or humming while preparing their modest meals and think, is this what normal people feel all the time? Thomas turned out to be surprisingly easy to love. He wasn't demanding or cruel like the husbands Eleanor had seen in the village, men who treated their wives like furniture. Instead, he'd sit by the fireplace reading while she worked, occasionally looking up to watch her with this quiet admiration that made her cheeks flush. When his eyesight started failing, the illness creeping in like an unwanted guest, Eleanor began reading aloud to him. She'd never considered herself good at anything beyond sewing, but Thomas would close his eyes and listen to her voice like it was music. "You make even the dullest passages sound beautiful," he'd say, and she'd think he was just being kind. But there was something genuine in his tone, something that suggested he really meant it. These weren't just words filling silence. This was connection, real and raw. The coughing fits came mostly at night, violent enough to shake the whole bed. Eleanor would wake up immediately, lighting a candle and holding Thomas's hand until the storm passed. She never complained, never showed frustration, even when sleep became a rare luxury. Here's what she learned about caring for someone who's slowly disappearing. It's like holding sand. The tighter you grip, the faster it slips away. But you keep holding anyway because letting go isn't an option. She'd make special broths from recipes the village healer suggested, adding herbs that were supposed to help with breathing. Did they work? Who knows? But Thomas would drink them and smile at her like she'd just served him a feast fit for kings. That smile became Eleanor's religion, her purpose, her reason for getting up each morning. There were these little moments that kept her going, tiny revelations that proved she hadn't made a terrible mistake. Thomas saved every button she replaced on his clothes, kept them in a small wooden box like they were precious gems. "These were sewn by your hands," he'd explain when she caught him adding another one to his collection. It was absurd, really, keeping used buttons like treasures, but it made Eleanor feel seen in a way she'd never experienced. He'd also insist she take the last slice of bread, claiming he'd already eaten, even though she knew he hadn't. When she'd confront him about it, he'd just shrug and say, "You need your strength for all that sewing." These weren't grand gestures, no flowers every week, no poetry written in her honor, but they were real, and real mattered more than grand. One evening, Eleanor was working on a particularly difficult repair, lace that kept tearing no matter how gentle she was, and she felt Thomas watching her. Not in a creepy way, but with this intense focus that made her self-conscious. "What?" she finally asked, laughing nervously. "I'm just amazed," he said softly. "The way your hands move, the concentration on your face. You turn ordinary fabric into something whole again. That's not just a skill, Eleanor. That's a gift." Nobody had ever called her talented before. Her work was just work, a way to survive, nothing special. But the way Thomas looked at her in that moment, like she was an artist creating masterpieces instead of a seamstress mending torn clothes, it shifted something inside her. Maybe she wasn't just invisible Eleanor anymore. Maybe she was becoming someone worth noticing, The mysterious monthly visitor kept coming, that well-dressed man with expensive shoes and an air of importance that seemed out of place in their humble neighborhood. He'd arrive, speak with Thomas in hushed tones behind closed doors, and leave, looking troubled. Eleanor tried not to let it bother her, tried to focus on the good parts of her new life. But curiosity is a strange companion. It whispers questions when you're trying to sleep, plants doubts when you're trying to trust. "Who is that man?" she asked Thomas one night after a particularly long visit. "Just an old friend helping me settle some affairs," Thomas replied, but his eyes didn't meet hers. It was the first time he'd ever avoided her gaze, and it felt like a tiny crack in the foundation they'd been building. She let it go, though. Some secrets, she told herself, aren't worth the conflict of digging them up. Thomas would sometimes say things that didn't quite fit with his story of being a simple working man. He'd reference places, Paris museums, London theaters, countryside estates, with the familiarity of someone who'd actually been there, not just heard about them. He knew about art in a way that suggested education far beyond what poor men could afford. Once, when she mentioned a political development she'd overheard at the market, Thomas launched into this detailed analysis that would have impressed scholars. Then he caught himself, trailing off awkwardly. "I read a lot," he'd explain, but Eleanor was starting to wonder what kind of books a dying poor man had access to. These were small inconsistencies, easy enough to ignore when weighed against the genuine affection he showed her. Still, they accumulated like dust in corners, invisible until suddenly you notice how much has gathered. But here's the thing about love that nobody warns you about. It makes you willing to ignore red flags the size of buildings. Eleanor saw the signs that something wasn't adding up, felt the weight of unspoken truths hanging between them. Yet every time doubt crept in, Thomas would do something that reminded her why she'd said yes in that church. He'd reach for her hand during his worst coughing fits, not because he needed physical support, but because her touch seemed to calm the storm inside him. He'd thank her for the smallest things, clean sheets, warm meals, her presence, like they were extraordinary gifts instead of basic care. The way he looked at her, even when illness made everything else fade, contained a kind of reverence that made her feel valuable for the first time in her entire life. Whatever secrets he was keeping, whatever mysteries lurked in his past, could they really be worse than returning to invisibility? She wasn't sure she wanted to find out. Something started shifting around the 4th month of marriage, subtle as a shadow growing longer at dusk. Eleanor couldn't quite put her finger on it at first. Just this nagging feeling that she was missing pieces of a puzzle she didn't even know she was supposed to be solving. Thomas remained kind, attentive, loving in all the ways that mattered. But there were these moments, these tiny fractures in the narrative he'd built, that made her pause mid-stitch and wonder. It's like when you've memorized every crack in your ceiling and suddenly notice one you swear wasn't there before. Makes you question everything you thought you knew. The mysterious monthly visitor became more frequent, sometimes showing up twice in 3 weeks. Each time, the man would arrive in clothing that cost more than Eleanor's entire shop, carrying himself with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about where your next meal's coming from. He'd nod politely at Eleanor, but his eyes held something that made her uncomfortable. Was it pity? Warning? She couldn't tell. One particular visit stuck with Eleanor like a splinter she couldn't extract. The well-dressed man arrived during a rainstorm, water dripping from his expensive coat onto their humble floor. Thomas ushered him into their tiny bedroom, the only place with any privacy, and closed the door. But walls in poor cottages aren't exactly soundproof, and Eleanor heard fragments. "Your family is getting impatient," the man said. "The situation can't continue indefinitely." Thomas's response was too quiet to hear, but the tension in his voice came through clear as day. When the man left, he looked at Eleanor with such sadness that it stopped her heart for a second. "Take care of him," he said simply. Not "take care of yourself" or "good day," but "take care of him." Like Thomas was some precious cargo Eleanor was temporarily guarding. It planted seeds of doubt that started growing in the dark corners of her mind. Then there were Thomas's random slips, moments when the careful character he'd constructed would crack just enough to reveal something underneath. They were discussing the village festival one evening, and Eleanor mentioned how she'd never seen a proper theatrical performance. "Oh, you'd love Shakespeare done well," Thomas said enthusiastically. "I remember seeing Hamlet at the Royal Theatre. The way the actor playing the prince captured that internal conflict between duty and desire." He stopped abruptly, realizing what he'd revealed. The Royal Theatre? That wasn't a place working men went. "I mean, I heard about it," he corrected quickly, but the damage was done. Eleanor pretended not to notice, but filed it away with all the other inconsistencies. She was building quite a collection, like forbidden evidence she didn't want to examine too closely. His knowledge bothered her more as time went on. Thomas could discuss philosophy like he'd studied it formally, reference historical events with the precision of someone who'd been taught by private tutors, and sometimes, when he forgot to monitor himself, he'd use words that didn't belong in a poor man's vocabulary. "The dichotomy of human nature," he'd say, then catch Eleanor's confused expression and rephrase, "I mean, how people can be two things at once." But why would he need to rephrase if he was naturally a simple man? Eleanor started paying closer attention, watching for these slips, like a detective gathering clues to a crime she wasn't sure had been committed. Part of her wanted to confront him directly, demand the truth. But a bigger part was terrified of what that truth might be, afraid that knowing would shatter the fragile happiness she'd built her whole life around. The incident that really started unraveling things happened on a Wednesday. Eleanor remembered because Wednesdays she always did the washing. Thomas had gone for his daily walk, doctor's orders to keep his lungs working. Eleanor was changing the bed linens when she noticed the drawer of his small nightstand was slightly open. She'd never looked through his things before. Privacy felt important, especially in a marriage built on such unusual foundations. But something made her pause that day, some instinct whispering that secrets were piling up too high to ignore. Her hand trembled as she pulled the drawer open fully. Inside, beneath some folded handkerchiefs, was a ring. Not just any ring. This was heavy gold, ornate, with an intricate design she'd never seen on anyone in their village. Dragons intertwined with crowns, symbols that suggested power and lineage. This wasn't the kind of thing you picked up at a market stall. Eleanor lifted the ring carefully, as if it might burn her fingers. The weight alone told her it was real gold, probably worth more than she'd earn in 10 years of sewing. Beneath it lay an envelope, sealed with red wax that bore the same dragon and crown design. Her heart hammered so loud she could hear it in her ears. This was the moment. She could open it, discover whatever enigma Thomas was hiding, force the truth into the light. Or she could close the drawer, pretend she'd never seen anything, continue living in the comfortable fiction they'd created together. Her fingers actually touched the wax seal, feeling its smoothness, imagining the snap as it broke. But something stopped her. Maybe it was cowardice. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was the deep-down knowledge that once you open certain doors, you can never close them again. She placed everything back exactly as she'd found it, closed the drawer, and sat on the bed trying to stop shaking. That night, Eleanor couldn't look at Thomas the same way. Every gesture felt loaded with hidden meaning. Every word, a potential clue. When he thanked her for dinner, the same simple stew she made twice a week, she wondered if he was used to fancier food, if he was secretly disgusted by their humble meals. When he held her hand during his evening cough, she questioned whether the affection was real or just part of some elaborate performance. The worst part wasn't the lying itself. People lie for all sorts of reasons, some even noble. The worst part was the uncertainty, the not knowing where the performance ended and the real Thomas began. Was any of it real? The gentleness, the gratitude, the way he looked at her like she hung the moon. Was it all just an act? She wanted to scream, to shake him and demand answers. Instead, she smiled and read to him from his book, her voice steady even as her world tilted on its axis. Sleep became impossible that night and many nights after. Eleanor would lie next to Thomas, listening to his breathing, studying his face in the moonlight for clues she'd missed. Who was this man she'd married? The evidence was mounting. Mysterious, wealthy visitors. Knowledge he shouldn't possess. Expensive items hidden away. Sealed letters with noble crests. It pointed to something big, something that made their entire marriage feel like it was built on quicksand. But here's the twisted thing. Even knowing he was keeping massive secrets, even suspecting their whole relationship might be based on lies, she couldn't bring herself to leave. Because whatever Thomas was hiding, his presence in her life had transformed her from invisible to seen, from forgotten to cherished. Was that worth living with the constant whisper of deception? She didn't know. All she knew was that the truth, when it finally came, and she sensed it would come soon, would either cement their bond or destroy it completely. There'd be no middle ground, no comfortable compromise. The revelation was coming, inevitable as dawn, and Eleanor wasn't sure she was ready to face it. The truth arrived on a spring morning so ordinary that Eleanor would later marvel at how life-changing moments never announce themselves properly. Thomas had left early for his walk. The doctors insisted fresh air was crucial, though Eleanor suspected he just needed space to be whoever he really was without her watching. She was at her sewing table, working on a commission that would barely pay for groceries, when the knock came. Not the gentle tap of neighbors or the hesitant knock of customers, but something authoritative, demanding. Eleanor opened the door, expecting maybe the tax collector or some village official. Instead, she found 4 men in uniforms so pristine they looked like they'd never seen a day of actual work. Behind them, parked on her humble street like a jewel in a pile of rocks, sat a carriage that probably cost more than every house on the block combined. The door bore that same dragon and crown design she'd seen on Thomas's hidden ring, gleaming gold in the morning sun. "Lady Eleanor?" the tallest man asked, his voice carrying the kind of respect she'd never heard directed at her. Eleanor almost laughed. Would have, if the situation wasn't so surreal. Lady. She was a seamstress, daughter of a seamstress, granddaughter of a seamstress. There were no ladies in her family tree, just working women trying to survive. "I think you've got the wrong house," she said, already moving to close the door. But the man's hand stopped it gently, but firmly. "You are married to Thomas Edward Ashford, correct?" Her stomach dropped. That was Thomas's name, though he'd never used the middle name or the Ashford part with such formality. "Yes, but—" "Then you are indeed Lady Eleanor Ashford, Duchess of Ashford. And I'm afraid we need to discuss your husband's situation. Your Grace." The title hung in the air like a secret that had finally escaped its cage, and Eleanor felt the world tilt sideways. Duchess. Duchess. The word repeated in Eleanor's head like a broken bell, each clang more absurd than the last. She invited the men in because what else do you do when four official-looking people insist your nobility? They sat awkwardly in her tiny parlor, their expensive uniforms contrasting sharply with her threadbare furniture. The head officer, she learned his name was Mr. Pemberton, explained everything with the careful tone you'd use with someone who might shatter. Thomas Edward Ashford wasn't a poor, dying widower. He was the Duke of Ashford, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in England. He owned estates spanning thousands of acres, controlled mines and factories, had influence in Parliament itself. The man she'd been reading bedtime stories to could buy her entire village without noticing the expense. Eleanor's hands started shaking so badly she had to sit on them. "That's impossible," she whispered. He's just—" But the evidence Mr. Pemberton presented made denial impossible. Documents, seals, even a small portrait of Thomas, younger, healthier, dressed in clothing that screamed wealth and power. The story tumbled out like water from a broken dam. Thomas's first wife had died in childbirth, along with their son 3 years ago. The grief broke him completely. He'd tried to end his own life twice, spent months in such deep depression that doctors genuinely feared for his survival. "And then he found you," Mr. Pemberton said, something almost like warmth entering his professional tone. For the first time in 3 years, His Grace wanted to live again. Eleanor's mind was racing through every interaction, every moment, recontextualizing everything she thought she knew. The worn coat Thomas had brought to be mended, probably deliberately chosen to look poor. The counted coins, a performance. The humble cottage, the simple meals, the life they'd built. All of it constructed on a foundation of carefully crafted lies. "Why didn't he tell me?" Eleanor asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Because, Your Grace, you treated him like a person. Everyone else in his life wanted something. Power, money, influence, connection. You just wanted him." Mr. Pemberton's words were meant to be comforting, but they just made Eleanor feel manipulated. She'd been an experiment, a test, maybe even a toy for a bored nobleman playing at being poor. The betrayal tasted like copper in her mouth, sharp and undeniable. Had anything between them been real, or was she just entertainment for a dying duke? The worst part was the conspiracy of it all, because it couldn't have been just Thomas. That monthly visitor was clearly reporting back, keeping the real world informed about the Duke's little adventure in poverty. How many people knew? How many were watching this poor seamstress fall in love with a lie, laughing at her naivety? Eleanor thought about all those moments she'd felt special, chosen, valued. Now they felt tainted, like beautiful fruit hiding rot inside. "Where is he now?" she managed to ask. "Still on his walk, we presume," Mr. Pemberton replied. "We thought it best to speak with you first, prepare you for what comes next." What comes next? As if life could just continue normally after discovering your entire marriage was built on deception. Eleanor wanted to scream, to throw these men out, to run somewhere her brain could process what she'd just learned. Instead, she sat frozen, watching dust motes dance in the sunlight streaming through her window, thinking how even those tiny particles had more substance than her understanding of reality. Mr. Pemberton continued talking. Something about arrangements, about moving her to appropriate quarters, about the social complications of Thomas's unconventional marriage. But Eleanor barely heard him. Her mind kept circling back to one question. Was the love real? Could you truly love someone while lying about everything? Thomas had held her through nightmares, had thanked her for the smallest kindnesses, had looked at her like she was his whole world. Were those moments genuine, or was he just that good of an actor? The possibility that it was all performance made her feel physically ill. But worse, was the alternative. That maybe Thomas had been genuine in his affection while still lying about everything else. Which was the bigger betrayal? Fake love honestly presented, or real love wrapped in deception? Eleanor didn't know, and the not knowing felt like drowning in doubt, with no shore in sight. When the men finally left, promising to return later to discuss the transition, Eleanor sat in the silence of her cottage that suddenly felt like a stage set. Everything looked different now, contaminated by knowledge. That chair Thomas loved sitting in? Probably uncomfortable for someone used to luxury furniture. The simple meals she'd made with such care? Probably a joke compared to what he usually ate. Even her sewing, which he'd praised so genuinely, or had he, now felt like child's play to someone who could afford the finest tailors in Europe. She picked up the book they'd been reading together, felt its worn pages, and wondered if Thomas had already read it years ago in some fancy library. The revelation had poisoned everything, turned beauty into questions and love into uncertainty. When Thomas came home from his walk, found her sitting in the dimness holding that book, he'd know immediately that the secret was out. And Eleanor had no idea what she'd say to him. No clue how to bridge the chasm that had just opened between the man she thought she married and the stranger who'd been pretending all along. Thomas returned from his walk with wildflowers, simple daisies he'd picked from the field, the kind of gesture that had always made Eleanor's heart melt. But today, when he opened the door with that gentle smile, he found her sitting exactly where she'd been for hours, the sealed letter with the dragon crest laid out on the table between them like evidence at a trial. His face went white, then gray, then something beyond pale that made him look like he might collapse right there. The flowers dropped from his hand, petals scattering across the floor like the fragments of the life they'd built together. "Eleanor," he started, voice cracking on her name. "I can explain." And that's when something inside Eleanor broke. Not shattered, but cracked wide open, releasing 3 months of swallowed questions and ignored doubts. "Can you?" she heard herself shout, and it was the first time she'd ever raised her voice at anyone, let alone him. "Can you explain why I had 4 men show up calling me Your Grace? Can you explain why you married me without telling me you're a duke?" Thomas moved toward her, hands outstretched like he was approaching a wounded animal. And maybe that's exactly what she was. "Please, let me..." "Let you what?" Eleanor was standing now, trembling with rage and hurt and confusion, all tangled together. "Let you tell me more lies? Let you explain how making a fool of me was somehow noble? I married a dying widower, Thomas. A poor man who needed companionship in his final months. That's who I said yes to, not some aristocrat playing dress-up in poverty." Her words were weapons, and she watched each one hit him like a physical blow. Thomas actually stumbled backward, catching himself on the doorframe. Then, in a move that shocked them both, he dropped to his knees right there on their humble floor. A duke, kneeling before a seamstress. The symbolism wasn't lost on Eleanor, but it didn't soften the betrayal burning in her chest like forbidden fire. "You're right," Thomas said, and his voice was breaking in ways she'd only heard during his worst coughing fits. "You're absolutely right to be furious. I lied about who I was, about what I had, about everything except..." He looked up at her with eyes so full of pain that Eleanor had to look away. "Everything except how I felt about you. Eleanor, I was dying. Not just from illness, from loneliness, from emptiness, from being surrounded by people who only saw my title and my money. Every conversation was calculated, every relationship transactional. I was so tired of being the Duke of Ashford that I wanted to stop existing entirely." His hands were shaking where they gripped his knees. Then I walked into your shop, and you looked at me like I was just a person. You fixed my coat with such care, like it mattered that I'd be warm. Nobody had cared about my comfort in years, only my status, my wealth, my usefulness. Eleanor wanted to stay angry, wanted to hold on to the righteous fury that felt safer than the complicated truth he was offering. But his words were digging under her defenses, forcing her to remember those early days. The way Thomas had seemed so grateful for small kindnesses, how he'd looked almost surprised when she'd asked about his day, like the answer mattered. "So you lied to keep me treating you like a human being?" she asked, hearing the bitterness in her own voice. "Is that supposed to make it better? You married me under false pretenses, Thomas. You let me believe we were equals, that we were building something real together, all while knowing you could walk away whenever you wanted, back to your palaces and your power, leaving me with nothing but memories of being some nobleman's charity project." The words tasted like poison coming out, but she couldn't stop them. 3 days of silence had built up too much pressure, and now it was all flooding out. "It was never charity," Thomas insisted, still on his knees like he was praying for forgiveness from a God who wasn't sure about granting it. "Eleanor, before I met you, I'd written my will. Everything settled, arrangements made. I was ready to die, wanted to die even. Then you smiled at me over that mended coat, and something shifted. You made me want to see tomorrow. Then the next day. Then the day after that. Every morning I woke up next to you was a morning I chose life over giving up." Tears were streaming down his face now, no attempt to hide them. "I was terrified that if you knew who I really was, you'd change. You'd start seeing the Duke instead of Thomas. You'd treat me like everyone else does, carefully, strategically, always aware of what I could do for you. And I couldn't bear it. I couldn't lose the one person who made me feel human again." Eleanor spent 3 days locked in their bedroom, refusing to speak to him, refusing meals, refusing everything. Thomas slept on the floor outside the door. She could hear him coughing at night, hear him wake from nightmares calling her name. Part of her wanted to open the door, comfort him like she always had. But a bigger part felt paralyzed by conflict, torn between two truths that couldn't coexist. He'd lied about everything, and he'd given her the only love she'd ever known. Which mattered more? On the second day, she heard Mr. Pemberton return, heard hushed conversation about arrangements and proper transition. Thomas's voice, hoarse and broken, said something she couldn't quite make out, followed by silence. That night, his coughing got worse. The stress was clearly aggravating his condition. Eleanor pressed her ear to the door, listening to him struggle for breath, and felt her resolve cracking like ice in spring. By the third day, Eleanor had talked herself in circles so many times she was dizzy with it. Yes, he'd lied. Yes, he'd manipulated the situation. Yes, everything about their courtship was built on deception. But, and this was the but that kept her up at night, were the feelings fake? She thought about every moment. The way he'd held her hand during coughing fits, seeking comfort not from a servant, but from her specifically. The way he'd saved those buttons she'd sewn, treating them like treasures when he could afford diamonds. The way he'd looked at her reading aloud, like her voice was the most beautiful sound in the world. The way he'd chosen her when he could have had anyone. Lies about money and title didn't erase the truth of those moments, did they? Or did the foundation of deception poison everything built on top of it? Eleanor didn't know, and the uncertainty was eating her alive from the inside out. She thought about what Mr. Pemberton had said. You treated him like a person. That's what this all came down to. Thomas had been so starved for genuine human connection that he'd lied to preserve it. Was that evil, or was that desperate? Eleanor knew desperation intimately. She'd spent 29 years desperate to be seen, to matter, to be chosen. Thomas had spent 3 years desperate to be valued for himself rather than his title. They were both broken people who'd found each other in the wreckage and built something beautiful, even if the foundation was cracked. On the third evening, as sunset painted their cottage walls gold, Eleanor finally understood the question she needed to answer. Could she forgive the lies for the sake of the love? Could she accept that maybe real love sometimes comes wrapped in imperfect packages, delivered by imperfect people doing imperfect things for reasons that made sense in their broken worlds? She opened the bedroom door to find Thomas exactly where she expected, slumped against the wall, looking worse than he had in months. The stress had accelerated his decline. She could see it in the hollows under his eyes, the way his hands shook, the raspy quality of his breathing. He looked up when the door opened, hope and fear warring on his face. Eleanor sat down next to him on the floor, not touching, not yet, but present. "I didn't marry the Duke of Ashford," she said quietly, and watched his face crumple. Then she continued, "And I'm not going to start now. I married the man who saved buttons like they were treasures, who thanked me for tea like it was a miracle, who made me feel, for the first time in my entire life, like I mattered to someone." She finally looked at him, really looked at him. "If you're still that man, if that part was real, then we're married, actually married. But no more secrets, Thomas. No more hidden truths. If we're doing this, we're doing it honestly, or we're not doing it at all." The world, as it turns out, doesn't care much about two people deciding to love each other against all odds. Eleanor learned this harsh truth the morning after her reconciliation with Thomas, when letters started arriving. Thick, expensive envelopes sealed with wax that screamed importance and disapproval in equal measure. The first was from Thomas's cousin, a Lord something or other, expressing grave concern about the Duke's unfortunate entanglement with a commoner. The second came from a distant aunt, who had the audacity to suggest Thomas was clearly not in his right mind and needed proper guidance from family. By the third letter, Eleanor stopped reading them herself and just handed them to Thomas, watching his jaw tighten as he scanned the contents. "They want you gone," he said flatly, crumpling yet another demand for annulment. "They're calling our marriage a scandal, an embarrassment, a stain on the family name." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not fear exactly, but the grim recognition that choosing Thomas meant choosing war with an entire social class. The conspiracy against their marriage became more organized within weeks. Thomas's family, people Eleanor had never met and who'd never bothered to check if their grieving relative was even alive, suddenly had very strong opinions about his choices. They sent lawyers, church officials, even a doctor who declared Thomas mentally unfit after a 5-minute conversation. Can you imagine? A man owns half the countryside, but marry someone below your station and suddenly you're incompetent. The whispers spread through high society like wildfire. "Did you hear about Ashford? Married his seamstress. No proper ceremony, no family present, didn't even observe appropriate mourning for his first wife. Absolutely scandalous." Eleanor heard about it third hand from the village baker, who'd heard it from a servant who worked in a noble house. The fact that strangers were discussing her marriage, judging it, condemning it, calling it invalid, made her feel exposed in ways she'd never experienced. Her private love had become public entertainment, and she hated every second of it. Mr. Pemberton delivered the worst news on a gray Tuesday morning. The family consortium, that's what they called themselves, like they were a business rather than relatives, had formally petitioned to have the marriage annulled. Their arguments were creative. She'd give them that. Thomas was mentally incompetent due to grief and illness. Eleanor had taken advantage of a vulnerable man. The marriage lacked proper witnesses and documentation. It violated about 17 different social protocols that Eleanor didn't even know existed. They're also suggesting, Mr. Pemberton said carefully, clearly uncomfortable, that Your Grace might have engineered this situation for financial gain. Eleanor laughed, actually laughed, because the absurdity was too much. She'd married Thomas thinking he was poor. If she'd been a gold digger, she'd failed spectacularly at basic research. But logic doesn't matter when powerful people want something. They'd constructed a narrative where she was the villain, and they were going to push that story until it stuck. The pressure intensified when Thomas's solicitor, a man named Mr. Blackwood, who looked like he'd never smiled in his entire life, arrived with what he called a generous settlement offer. He laid it out on their humble table like he was doing Eleanor a favor. £10,000, a cottage in the countryside. Much nicer than this one, he assured her. And a letter of reference that would protect her reputation. All she had to do was sign the annulment papers and disappear quietly from Thomas's life. "This is more money than you'd see in 3 lifetimes of sewing," Mr. Blackwood said, his tone suggesting he thought she'd be stupid not to take it. "You'd be set for life, comfortable, secure, and His Grace would be free to marry someone appropriate." That word, appropriate, hung in the air like a slur. Thomas said nothing during Mr. Blackwood's presentation, but Eleanor could feel the tension radiating off him like heat. He was waiting to see what she'd choose, and in that silence, she understood something crucial. He'd accept whatever decision she made. If she took the money and walked away, he wouldn't fight it. Not because he didn't love her, but because he'd never force her to endure the hell his world was about to unleash. That realization, that he loved her enough to let her go, made Eleanor's decision crystal clear. She picked up the annulment papers, and for a second, Mr. Blackwood's face lit up with victory. Then she tore them in half. "I think you can leave now," she said calmly. "And you can tell the family consortium that Eleanor Ashford, yes, Ashford, isn't going anywhere. They can choke on their disapproval for all I care." The consequences were immediate and vicious. Shops that had welcomed Eleanor's business suddenly had reasons she couldn't patronize them. Policy changes and private clientele only, excuses that were obviously connected to her now public status as the Duke's inappropriate wife. Women who'd been cordial neighbors crossed the street to avoid her. The village priest, who'd married them without hesitation when he thought Thomas was a simple man, suddenly discovered irregularities in their ceremony that might require investigation. It was social warfare, and Eleanor was learning fast that nobility doesn't fight with fists. They fight with exclusion, with whispers, with making your life so uncomfortable that you voluntarily disappear. Even the servants Thomas had called from his estate, because apparently dukes don't clean their own cottages, treated Eleanor with barely concealed contempt. She could hear them whispering in corners, questioning how long this situation would last, placing bets on when she'd take the money and run. The worst attack came wrapped in concern and delivered by a woman who introduced herself as Lady Catherine Ashford, Thomas's sister-in-law from his first marriage. She arrived in a carriage that probably cost more than Eleanor's childhood home, dressed in mourning clothes that made an obvious point about proper respect for the dead. Lady Catherine didn't bother with pleasantries. "You seem like a practical girl," she said, looking around the cottage with thinly veiled disgust. "So let's be practical. You cannot possibly believe this arrangement will work. You have no education, no breeding, no understanding of what being a duchess entails. Thomas is being sentimental because he's dying and lonely. But when reality sets in, when he recovers and returns to his actual life, you'll be a burden, an embarrassment, a mistake he'll spend the rest of his life explaining. Her words were surgical strikes designed to hit every insecurity Eleanor had. Take the settlement, preserve some dignity, walk away before you're dragged away. Eleanor felt every word land like a blow. Not because Lady Catherine was wrong about her lack of preparation, but because she was voicing every doubt Eleanor had already tortured herself with during sleepless nights. Could she really be a duchess? Could someone who'd spent her whole life invisible suddenly navigate a world of protocols and politics and people who thought she was worthless? The practical part of her brain, the part that had kept her alive through poverty and obscurity, screamed that Lady Catherine was right. £10,000 was security, freedom, a life without constant judgment. But then, Eleanor thought about Thomas sleeping on the floor outside their bedroom for 3 days, too sick to stand, but too devoted to leave. She thought about buttons saved like treasures, about gratitude for tea, about a dying man who'd chosen life because she'd made it worth living. She looked Lady Catherine dead in the eye and said something she'd never had the courage to say before. "You're right that I don't know how to be a duchess, but I know how to love your brother-in-law better than any appropriate woman ever did. And if that's not enough for your world, then your world can go find someone else to impress. Thomas chose me. I chose him. That's the only approval we need." Something miraculous started happening in the months after Eleanor told the entire aristocratic world to go to hell. Thomas, who'd been steadily declining, who'd been coughing blood and struggling to breathe, who'd looked like death was winning, started getting better. Not overnight, nothing dramatic like in fairy tales, but gradually, consistently, undeniably better. The coughing fits became less frequent, less violent. Color returned to his face, the kind of healthy flush that had been absent since Eleanor met him. He started eating more, sleeping deeper, laughing louder. The doctor who came to check on him, a real one this time, not the family's paid puppet, was genuinely baffled. "I don't understand it," he admitted, checking Thomas's heartbeat with obvious confusion. "By all medical logic, you should be worse. The stress alone should have accelerated your decline. Instead, you're improving." Thomas just smiled and looked at Eleanor. "I found a reason to live," he said simply. "Turns out, that's better medicine than anything you can prescribe." Eleanor understood what the doctors couldn't measure with their instruments and their science. Thomas hadn't been dying from illness alone. He'd been dying from loneliness, from the soul-crushing weight of living a life that felt meaningless. You can have all the wealth in the world, live in palaces, command respect from thousands, and still feel completely empty inside. That emptiness is its own kind of disease, maybe worse than physical sickness, because it attacks your will to keep existing. Thomas had lost his wife, his child, his purpose all at once. The grief had carved out everything inside him, leaving just a shell going through motions. Then, Eleanor had showed up with her gentle hands and her genuine care, and she'd given him something worth fighting for. Not his title, not his estates, not his legacy, just her presence, her laughter, her stubborn refusal to let the world tell her who she could love. That was powerful medicine, the kind that works from the inside out. They decided to have a second ceremony, a real one this time, in the same small church where they'd first married. Eleanor insisted on it, not because the first wedding wasn't valid in her heart, but because she wanted the world to see them choose each other publicly, deliberately, with full knowledge of who they both were. She spent weeks sewing her own wedding dress, pouring every ounce of skill she possessed into creating something beautiful. Not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because this dress represented her truth. She was still a seamstress, still proud of her craft, still the same Eleanor who'd mended a stranger's coat. The dress was simple, but elegant, made from fabric she could actually afford, embroidered with patterns that told their story in thread and needle. When Thomas saw her in it, he cried, actual tears streaming down his face, because she looked like herself, not like some costume version of who society thought a duchess should be. Thomas insisted on wearing that same coat, the first one Eleanor had mended, the one that had started everything. His family was horrified. "You cannot wear that to your wedding," his cousin protested. "It's common. It's beneath your station. It's perfect," Thomas interrupted firmly. "This coat represents the moment my life changed, the moment someone saw me as worth fixing. I'm wearing it, and that's final." Eleanor loved him so fiercely in that moment that her chest physically hurt. Here was a man who could wear silk and velvet, who owned clothing worth more than small countries, choosing a mended coat because it meant something. That's when you know love is real. When someone values the symbol of how you met over all the expensive alternatives society offers. They walked into that church looking like themselves, not like the Duke and Duchess everyone expected, but like Thomas and Eleanor, two broken people who'd somehow made each other whole. The ceremony was small, intimate, everything the first one had been, but with added weight of knowing. This time, when the priest asked if Eleanor took this man, she didn't just whisper, "I do." She looked directly at Thomas, at the family members sitting in disapproving silence, at the few genuine friends who'd shown up despite the scandal, and said loudly, clearly, "I already accepted him months ago when I thought he was dying and poor. Today, I'm just making sure the world accepts it too. Yes, I take Thomas. All of him. The parts he showed me and the parts he hid. The sickness and the health. The truth and the lies. I take all of it, because that's what love means." The church was dead silent. Even the disapproving relatives seemed struck speechless by the raw honesty. Thomas's hands were shaking when he slipped the ring on her finger. A simple band she'd helped design. Nothing ostentatious, just gold and a promise. When Thomas said his vows, his voice was steady for the first time in months. "Eleanor, you saved my life, not by mending my coat, but by mending me. You took a broken, dying man who'd given up on everything, and you showed him that life could still be gentle, that people could still be kind, that love didn't have to be complicated or political or strategic. It could just be two people choosing each other every single day." He paused, swallowing hard. "I lied to you about who I was, but every feeling, every moment of gratitude, every time I looked at you like you hung the stars, that was the truest thing I've ever felt. You're my second chance, Eleanor. My revelation that life is worth fighting for, and I promise to spend whatever time I have left making sure you never regret choosing me." By the time he finished, half the church was crying, even some of the relatives who'd fought hardest against the marriage. Truth has that effect. It cuts through pretense and touches something real in people, whether they want it to or not. The reception was held in their cottage, not in some grand estate. Eleanor had insisted, and for once Thomas's family didn't fight it. Maybe they realized they'd lost this battle, or maybe they were just exhausted from fighting a love that refused to die. Eleanor and Thomas served simple food, the kind working people eat, and it was the best meal some of those aristocrats had ever had, because it was made with actual care instead of obligation. People who'd never spoken to Eleanor except to criticize her found themselves drawn into conversation, discovering she was smart and funny and deeply principled. One elderly countess, who'd written a particularly nasty letter about the marriage, actually apologized. "I thought you were after his money," she admitted. "But watching you two together, I haven't seen genuine affection like that in high society in 40 years. We've all forgotten what real love looks like." Eleanor didn't gloat, didn't say, "I told you so." She just squeezed the woman's hand and said, "Maybe it's not too late to remember." That night, lying next to Thomas in their small bed, they'd refused to move to the estate, preferring their humble cottage to cold grandeur. Eleanor marveled at how far they'd come. From a chance encounter over a torn coat to weathering social warfare, from devastating secrets to radical honesty, from near death to surprising recovery. "Do you think we'll always have to fight this hard?" she asked into the darkness. Thomas pulled her closer, his breathing easier than it had been in years. "Probably," he admitted. "People don't like it when you break their rules about who deserves happiness. But here's what I've learned. Fighting for something real is easier than living with something fake. Every day with you, even the hard days, is better than every easy day I had before." Eleanor smiled against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Steady, strong, alive. The enigma of how love could heal what medicine couldn't would probably never be fully understood. But lying there, feeling Thomas's warmth, hearing his peaceful breathing, Eleanor didn't need to understand it. She just needed to keep choosing it, keep fighting for it, keep believing that sometimes the most forbidden love stories are the ones most worth telling. So, now tell me something. After learning about Eleanor and Thomas's story, do you still believe that true love needs to make sense to others? Or have you finally understood that the deepest connections are born when we stop pretending to be who we're not? Think about it. How many times have you hidden who you really are out of fear of not being accepted? How many masks do you wear every day to fit into the expectations of people who, deep down, don't even really know you? Eleanor could have accepted those 10,000 pounds and lived comfortably for the rest of her life. But you know what she chose? She chose the conflict, the struggle, the judgment of the entire world. Because she understood something that most people take a lifetime to learn. Money buys comfort, but it doesn't buy the feeling of being truly seen by someone. Thomas had everything: power, wealth, status, and yet he was dying inside because nobody loved him for who he truly was. Until a simple seamstress showed him that importance doesn't come from titles. It comes from how you treat people when nobody's watching. Now comes the question that really matters. What about you? Are you living to impress people who don't care about your happiness? Are you building a life based on appearances, hiding your true feelings, pretending to be someone you're not just to keep the peace? Or are you willing to tear up the papers of others' approval and finally choose what makes your heart beat faster? Even if that means facing criticism, judgment, and all those people who'll say you're crazy. Because this is the forbidden truth that nobody tells you. You can have the approval of the entire world and still feel empty. Or you can have just one person who truly sees you. And that can be enough to completely transform your life. Eleanor taught us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's looking into the abyss of uncertainty and jumping anyway, trusting that whoever truly matters will be there to hold your hand. So stop waiting for the perfect life to begin. Stop postponing happiness until you have everyone's approval. Stop believing that you need to be someone extraordinary to deserve extraordinary love. The truth, that hidden truth that society doesn't want you to discover, is that you're already enough, exactly as you are right now, with all your imperfections, your fears, your scars. The secret isn't in becoming perfect. It's in finding someone who chooses your imperfections along with you. Someone who saves your buttons like treasures. Someone who makes you want to live, even when everything seems lost. And you know what? This works both ways. You also need to be that person for someone. You need to learn to see beyond the masks, to value the authentic instead of the convenient, to choose depth instead of appearance. What's going to be your choice today? Will you keep living on autopilot, letting the fear of judgment control every decision? Or will you finally have the courage to be vulnerable, to show who you really are, to risk your heart for something worthwhile? Because I guarantee you one thing. At the end of your life, you won't regret the risks you took for true love. You'll regret the times you let fear win, the connections you didn't explore, the words you didn't say. Eleanor was invisible until she decided to be seen. Thomas was dying until he decided to live. And you? What's your decision? What are you going to do today? Not tomorrow, not when conditions are perfect, but today, to start living a more authentic, more courageous, more true life. Now tell me in the comments, would you have accepted those 10,000 pounds, or would you have torn up the papers like Eleanor did? Be honest, no judgment, just genuine curiosity. And if this story moved you, if it made you question your own choices, if it inspired you to be braver in the pursuit of real connections, then do this. Subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. Because every week I bring stories like this. Stories that nobility tried to hide. Enigmas from the past that reveal timeless truths about human nature, love, power, and what really matters when everything is taken from you. This is a space for those who are tired of superficial content and want to dive deep into the lessons that truly transform lives. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and come be part of this community of people who chose authenticity instead of approval. See you in the next video, and remember, your story also deserves to be lived with courage. Don't let fear write the ending.